Welcome to the Library of Virginia. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the first event of our 2025 Carole Weinstein Author Series. This evening we are joined by Katrina Powell, who will be discussing her new book, Beginning Again, Stories of Movement and Migration in Appalachia. The oral histories in this collection share narratives of refugees, immigrants, and generations-long residents in Appalachia, highlighting the ways that communities both resist and complicate stereotypes about the region and create spaces of belonging, home, and connection. The book seeks to provide a more nuanced picture about lived experiences in Appalachia to counter the damaging myths that circulate about groups of people. Katrina Powell is a professor of English and founding director of the Center for Refugee, Migrant and Displacement Studies at Virginia Tech. Her research focuses on narratives of displacement, autobiography, and ethics in research methodologies. She is author of several books, including The Anguish of Displacement, The Politics of Literacy in the Letters of Mountain Families in the Shenandoah National Park, Identity and Power in Narratives of Displacement, and Performing Autobiography. She is co-editor of the Monuments Across Appalachian Virginia project funded by the Mellon Foundation. Tonight's program is made possible thanks to the generous support through the Carole Weinstein Endowment for Virginia Authors of the Library of Virginia Foundation. The Carole Weinstein Author Series supports the literary arts by bringing both new and well-known authors to the Library of Virginia. This series focuses on Virginia authors and Virginia subjects across all genres. We are so very grateful for Carole and Marcus Weinstein's incredible support of the library and of this program tonight. Carole Weinstein was not able to join us tonight, but she did ask if we could share her remarks. So I will read those to you now. Dear friends of the library, I am so sorry that I cannot be here tonight to introduce Katrina Powell, the author of Beginning Again, Stories of Movement and Migration in Appalachia. I would also like to give a nod to our dear friend Nikki Giovanni, who wrote the foreword before she passed away this past December. This collection of oral histories about immigrants and marginalized communities is the first in this series, author series, but is only one of the 22 books published by an award-winning nonprofit, Voices of Witness, that focuses on the systemic injustice within communities all over the world. You can find a list of these voices at the end of this book. She asked me to hold this up. This again is available in the bookstore if you don't already have a copy. I have read all 12 of the stories that Ms. Powell relates in Beginning Again, and was horrified and inspired by their amazing resilience. This work focuses on the region in Northwest Virginia, Appalachia, and one in particular is set in Big Stone Gap, Adriana Trigiani's hometown. How could the selection committee for this year's series possibly have foreseen the political relevance of today's emphasis on immigration and the frightening atmosphere of ICE's massive deportation efforts? What bewilders me is how much xenophobia and racial intolerance exists throughout the United States toward foreign or alien people, and she has both of those words in quotes. Unless some of you here tonight are Native Americans, all of us were once part of an immigrant family. Beginning Again will motivate you to examine your own prejudice. And as this author series progresses throughout the summer, in the works of David Baldacci, Adriana Trigiani, Crystal Wilkinson, and Laura Helton. Thank you for allowing me to share an audible version of my welcome. Carole Weinstein, written on April 10th, 2025. So without further ado, I welcome Katrina Powell.
so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really moved by it, and I'm sorry not to meet Carole, and hope I get to in the future. And thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me. I have to say how happy I am to be in Richmond. I grew up in Madison County, which is very rural and mountainous, and coming to Richmond was always a treat for me. And now my kid is coming to school here in the fall, and I get to come. I know, I'm so happy about it. So thank you again. I think what I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit about the work that I did that led up to this project, and then I'll get right into it. So my first book is about Shenandoah National Park and the families who were displaced from Shenandoah National Park. I grew up in Madison, which is one of the counties that contributed land, which was taken via eminent domain from the families who lived in that area. And in the introduction, she mentioned my book is called The Anguish of Displacement, and this is sort of an academic study of the letters that you see here, the handwritten letters that families wrote into the government during that displacement process. And if you're interested in those letters, they're published in a book called Answer at Once, the Letters of Mountain Families in Shenandoah National Park from 1934 to 1938. And I bring this up in part because that process of publishing the letters was very involved because the letters are not yet in the public domain space, which meant I had to have permission from the families to publish them, or even to quote from them in the first book. I had to have permission. So most of the letter writers weren't living, and so I got in contact with their descendants. And in doing that, some people said, yes, of course, you may publish my grandmother's letter, no problem, send me a copy. Some people said, absolutely not, I have no interest because of the bitterness that remains around the park and families' relationships with the park. And some people wanted to know what exactly I was up to, what was I talking about, and so I took copies of the letters with me and invited myself over to their house and asked if, let them read it, let them have the copy, explained what I was doing, explained why I thought the words in those letters were so important to understand the history of Shenandoah National Park, because the story written about the people who lived there was so counter to what I first of all, had experienced as a person living in Madison County myself and growing up with people whose families had been displaced, but also what I was hearing in the letters. So in going over to people's homes and sharing the letters with them, they started to tell me stories about their families. And as I started listening to them and hearing more and more about the complexity of the history of Shenandoah National Park, it became clear that I needed to do an oral history project and to record their stories. And I was not trained in oral history methods, so I went and got trained. And at Columbia University has they have a whole program, a master's program. You can get a master's degree in oral history, but I did a little 2-week residency. I learned a lot about technology, I learned a lot about interviewing, and I had been I was a reporter in my first job, so I was comfortable with doing that kind of work. So that's where all this got started, and I knew I had already, part of my project in doing that, and doing all that work, was to highlight a counter story, a counter story of people and their lived experiences in relationship to what institutions of power might say about particular groups of people. And so the images you see here are some of the photographs that are available through the Library of Congress, and the handwritten letter. And then the document that you see there that's typed, I know you can't see what it says, it's probably too small, but that's an institutional document that was sent back to families. So they were getting these typewritten documents on Department of Interior letterhead and writing back on their handwritten letters. And so all that research led me then to thinking about displacement more broadly. And so most of my research since Shenandoah has focused on multiple kinds of displacement and the way that people tell stories about their displacement, no matter what the reason is, whether it's civil unrest, whether it's, natural disaster or routine flooding, which, as you know, is becoming more and more routinized in recent days. Again, natural disaster, or eminent domain or executive order. And so a lot of my research in the last 10 years has focused on local and global displacements and comparing the way people tell stories about them, about their displacement. So at Virginia Tech, I and several other folks founded the Center for Refugee, Migrant and Displacement Studies. And one of the things we wanted to do back in 2017, when there was a moment of real worry about how immigrants were being portrayed in the media, we decided we would have some intentional community building events at Virginia Tech, and we're not the only university to do that, college or library to do that, to make people feel welcome in our community. And the students and the faculty and the staff at Virginia Tech decided to hold several events to make people who had recently settled in the area feel welcome and feel like the university was a place for them to come and a resource for them, and potentially maybe a place for their children to come to school. So we held a bunch of events, writing workshops, arts workshops. The kids played soccer. It was really fun. So here's some images from that. We made little booklets for people to write in or draw in. And we were asking them questions about, I guess you can't see the title. Oh, yes, the title of the little booklet is Remembering Home, Building Future. So as you remember where you were and where you were rooted in place, and you were building a new future here in Virginia, what were some of the things that they were encountering? And again, they were telling amazing stories about their experiences of escape from where they had been to then the sort of new trauma of trying to make a way in a new country. So we decided that we would do another oral history project. And so we did some trainings, mostly of students, a lot of faculty and staff, and some community members in the region were really interested to learn how to do oral history. And it sounds really easy. You just sit and listen. And of course, you can do that. You can use your iPhone to record. You don't need fancy equipment. You can get fancy equipment and do a really high quality recording. I use this tiny little microphone and plug it right into my iPhone, and it makes pretty good quality, good sound quality, if you want to play it in a radio essay for NPR, for instance. They like the good stuff. And so we trained folks, and then we set about interviewing as many people as we could. And at about the same time, Voice of Witness, which is a nonprofit that publishes books about human rights issues, had a book fellowship competition, and I wrote in and said that I would like to do this project. And they were kind of fascinated, I think, by my idea because they didn't understand why it was Appalachia and why it was about migration. Because the folks who work at Voice of Witness are mostly in San Francisco. And a lot of people don't know that Virginia has always been a place of movement and mobility. Virginia and the country is founded on displacement. And so that history is often not known. Appalachia is often stereotyped. Migrants and immigrants are often stereotyped. And I wanted those narratives to come together in one place and to complicate them and to complicate what it means for those negative stereotypes to be floating around. So in beginning again, we interviewed about 100 people. And what Voice of Witness does is publish a book of those interviews, just a select few of those interviews. And if you'd like to talk about the selection process and whittling that down, that was not easy. So but the interviews themselves are all very important, and we have them all archived and collected them, and we did for each person who was willing to be interviewed, we made little booklets for them of their individual story. And so this is Elvira's, whose story made it in the book, but he also has his individual copy. And I'll tell you that this process took a long time, and that the narratives that are as printed here in the book are heavily mediated and edited. So if you've ever interviewed anyone before and you've seen what a transcript looks like from an interview and someone telling their story, you know that people tend to come back and forth to a particular topic. They might come back around a few minutes later. And so the transcripts themselves for about an hour-and-a-half interview are about 30, 40 pages long, too long to put all together in a book for kind of broader consumption. And so what we did was edit them down into more of a narrative style. So as you read the narratives, I think it's really important to understand how mediated they are by me and the other folks who worked on the project. That if someone started to talk about an event in minute 5 and they came back to it at minute 20, you're reading it all together as one narrative arc. And there's some argument in the oral history community about how appropriate that is. But we talk a lot with our narrators about that process to try to make the story more accessible for a broader public. So these are the 12 narrators in the book. And briefly, I'll just go through them. We have Cindy, whose family migrated from Mexico, escaping gang violence. Babakir, who came from Sudan, who was a teacher there. Sohaila from Afghanistan, Claudine from Rwanda, Micaiah from Big Stone Gap, Shay, who is from Vietnam, Elvira from Bosnia, who came in 1995 as a 14-year-old, Peter, who grew up in Washington, D.C., and then bought a big farm in Floyd County and has a camp for youth there, so city youth can come to the country. And I'll come back to the coffee pot. Rufus, who's an elder member of the Monacan Indian Nation. Hannah, who moved from the state of Washington to start a farm with her wife in Southwest Virginia. And Bart, who is a musician and whose family lost their land via eminent domain when the Tennessee Valley Authority was founded. So I'm going to start with a little excerpt from Sohaila. And Sohaila had escaped from her family in Afghanistan. She, as is common in Afghanistan, her husband had multiple wives, and she was the second wife. And the first wife abused Sohaila. And then when the husband died, the first wife's brothers also abused her. And she had no recourse because her first husband had tried to protect her some. And so she had to escape. And so she had a very harrowing story of escape with her young daughter. And this is part of what she says. It's better, living in Virginia, it's better, but things are still hard. I went to get my learner's driving permit, but I had to take a bus to get there. The bus didn't come, so we had to walk instead. We had no water, and my daughter was crying. I have to take the bus to see my head doctor, too. I want to drive a car, but I can't get a car or drive. I take the bus to work. At least there's a stop right here, close to the apartment. My daughter can walk to school, so this is a good place for us. And I feel like this part of her narrative is really important because it shows the everydayness of her struggle. Every day she's got to figure out how to navigate the bus system, which in Blacksburg is nothing like Richmond, obviously, but it is kind of complicated. And she had never used one before. She lived in a more rural area, and so had never used the bus system before. She also talked a lot about, she told me several times, my head is not good, my head is not good. And just how to navigate the trauma and recovering from the trauma and this living a normal life and getting her daughter to go to school and, making a place in their new home. I think that part of what is also important about Soheila's story is that it's ongoing. She's lived in the country she came in 2016, so she's lived in the country almost 10 years, and she continues to struggle. So I think there's an assumption that once someone arrives here as a refugee, they step off the plane and everything is fantastic. And there's a long transition process, and there are a lot of volunteers. There certainly is some government assistance available for refugees, but really it's not that much in comparison to the overall need, and often volunteers supplement that need, especially if someone is taking English lessons and not getting a job, taking English lessons first so that then they can get a job and speak English. And so the Blacksburg Refugee Partnerships supplements that time period for them. And I'm sure there are things, I know all over the state that organizations are doing that for people. Also, I will mention too that I interviewed Soheila 3 times, and the first time she speaks 5 languages, and she has no written literacy, but she speaks 5 languages. And so the first time I interviewed her, there was an interpreter, a translator, and the second time I called her and said, could I come and talk some more with her? And she said yes, and I said, who should I contact to translate? The same person? And she said, no, I speak English now. You will interview me in English. And she was doing great. My editors were like, are you sure? Because often it's important to have someone to be able to tell their story in their own language, to feel comfortable. And she was adamant, no, I speak English now. And so that sort of moment of, I guess I want to emphasize that because when you're interviewing someone about their life, their story, it's important for them to have control over the whole thing. If they want to stop talking, they don't want to talk about it anymore, or they don't want their story told, or they pull out at the last minute and don't want their narrative in the book at all, all these things are within their control. And she did a great job in English. So this next example is from Elvir, who was 14 when his family came from Bosnia. And his story is so great. This is the little booklet of his. I can pass that around. He talked a lot about being his parents' translator. And that's a common theme for children of migrants, helping their parents navigate, because children often learn English faster, or they're in school, so they're in places where they can practice their English more. So he talked a lot about that, but he also talked about then, as he grew up, went to college, went to graduate school, and now lives in Roanoke, and he is a member of the community who is so important to the youth in the area, including refugee and migrant youth. And so he's told me, I work with these young men because I was that person. I want to help them focus on getting educated, helping their families and communities. So we are their liaison to the community, their mentors and teachers. I give back this way because I remember those years, and I never had anybody to guide me. I feel like this is something that is needed specifically in the complex systems the boys are in right now. And he was talking about school or after-school programs and their own families. I help them with documentation, who to ask for this, where to go for that, and keep them focused. I've learned from them that they don't really need pushing in a direction, but just opening doors. And so Elvira is an example. His narrative tells the story that several narrators did tell about how they, when they first arrived in this country, received a lot of help, and then in turn become active community members also giving help, and how important that is for someone's transition to a new place, to not always be made to feel like you're the victim, not always being reduced to your immigration status, not always being looked at as someone who is in need, but also being part of that community and helping the community and contributing to the community, and how important that is. And most of the narratives spoke about that. And so finally, I want to mention Micaiah. Micaiah is from Big Stone Gap, and I'm going to read a little bit longer quote from him than you see here. He says, "The house I just moved into is the house my mom grew up in, her granny and great-granny too. Everybody on my mom's side of the family has been on this piece of property. I didn't appreciate this land when I was younger, but there's a rich legacy to this place. You know, Big Stone Gap is not perfect, and when I was younger, I remember talking to my friends, and they'd all say, 'We can't wait to leave,' but I'd say, 'I love it here. I love the mountains. I love being able to go outside and just sniff the air and have an almost overwhelming sense of nostalgia for how this place has shaped me to be who I am. Big Stone Gap is not perfect, and it has its issues, but if we all leave, it's never going to get better. It's never going to be the community that we want to see. One day, I plan on starting a family, and I want to at least have the option to build my family here, to raise my family here. And then they raise their kids here if they want to. They should at least have that option. But we won't have that option if we don't have safe, inclusive communities, if we don't have the infrastructure to try to clean up the years of damage from extractive industries that left no clean drinking water, for example. There's so many issues we need to fix, but it ain't going to happen if all the young people leave. If we all just decided that Appalachia is irredeemable and can't be safe, then who's going to fix it while we're all away? Micaiah was so fun to talk to. He talks really fast, and he has a lot to say. And he's an activist in his community and works for the Stay Project, which I encourage you to look up. The Highland Center is part of that, and he works for the Stay Project, which is basically a group of folks, mostly youth, trying to figure out how they can stay in Appalachia. And if there isn't economic opportunity available, then how they can make it. And make that opportunity become available for each other. And he's adamant about the stereotype about what an Appalachian is, who we think of when we think of an Appalachian. And he told me, a young black man who played football is not always thought of as an Appalachian. He's like, but I grew up here. I belong here as much as anyone else. And he wants to stay. He doesn't want to try to work somewhere else. In fact, one of our interviews, because it was COVID, we were talking on Zoom. And his Zoom screen had a window behind him, and as he was saying, "I want to stay here, I love the mountains," and he, flung his arm out and said, "Look at this, who wouldn't want to be here?" And so he was, in talking to him about editing his narrative, so we interviewed a few times, I put everything together in a coherent narrative, and his editing process was really interesting. He took a lot of things out. He's like, "No, I think people are expecting me to say that. I don't want that in my narrative." He had a definite message that he wanted to come out in his narrative. And so part of why I chose these three particular ones, and there are others that do this as well, is that whatever negative stereotype is out there about either refugees or immigrants or about Appalachians, and those can be quite damaging, I think, in terms of the way policies are made. I think some folks who hold those stereotypes then have the power to make some decisions by using those stereotypes as their evidence, rather than using actual real people as their evidence. And so part of what I think people like Sohaila, Elvire, and Micaiah, and some of the others tell us is that their making community is the counter-narrative. Whether they were already here, Rufus, for example, is a Monacan Indian Nation elder, and his family was forced to move many times throughout the decades, centuries, for the white settlers coming into Virginia, but also in the 1920s and 30s when there was a lot of economic upheaval and Native Americans were not able to work, and so they had to move and go to different states, but they didn't want to. This was their land, but they had to find work. And so all of these are examples of people making community where there maybe wasn't one, or where there is an assumption that there isn't going to be one. One of the negative assumptions I think about Americans generally is that they aren't welcoming to migrants, and particularly in rural places or in a place like Appalachia. And of course, living in a rural place and doing all the things we were doing to try to make people feel welcome, I knew that that wasn't true in all cases. And so that's part of why we wanted to have these narratives come together, because we felt like making community itself was a counter-narrative to those negative stereotypes. So the other thing that I think is important about some of these narratives is, while in some cases their stories are very dramatic or traumatic, like Sohaila's, for instance, they're really just ordinary people wanting to go to work, take care of their families, and contribute to their communities. So I also just wanted to mention that we do some other things at the Center for Refugee, Migrant and Displacement Studies. We have a journal called Roots and Resettlement, and it's a similar thing where we're talking someone who has roots in this area or in the United States or in Appalachia might want to contribute to this literary journal, but also someone who has recently come to the area might want to contribute to this journal, again, as a way to try to bring together those narratives as people make community. And then in the introduction, you mentioned that we're working on a project called Monuments Across Appalachia in Virginia now. It's funded by the Mellon Foundation, and it's similar in its approach to making sure that the stories that we know to be true from living in our communities have an opportunity to be told. Most of the monuments in Virginia there's a lack of representation of the diversity in the state within the monuments. And so this project is a way to try to give resources to groups that are trying to have their communities celebrated or remembered. And so one of the projects is Raising the Shade, which is in Rocky Mount, Virginia. And like many small towns in Virginia, the Confederate statue still sits at the county courthouse, and the community refuses to take it down. Or the people who have the power to make that decision refuse to take it down. And so the Franklin County NAACP proposed to build a statue to commemorate the Union colored troops, and wanted to have that statue put up in the town square directly across from the Confederate statue. And the town refused, and so the black church on the town square said that they would, on their private land, host the statue. And so this is just another example of how we can try to complicate the history of a place. You know, Franklin County, there's a lot of stereotypes about Franklin County being the place of moonshiners and such. But there's also a lot of folks there who are really interested in making sure the whole story is told about who fought in the Civil War and for what reason. And so the image you see there of the soldier is the prototype for the statue that will go up. And then the other photographs in this image are of the various monuments that we're working on across Appalachian Virginia. And I'd be happy to tell you more about those. And also at the Center for Refugee, Migrant and Displacement Studies, we continue doing oral history work. We also do a lot of work with a nonprofit called Elamisha Kakuma, which is a nonprofit located in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. And Elamisha means educate, so it's Educate Kakuma. And the three women in that photograph, the one in the pink and the yellow, Mary and Ding, and then the one on the your far right, Deirdre, who is a Virginia Tech grad. The three of them, plus another person named Joseph, they all founded the nonprofit Elamisha. And what they do is educate students who have graduated from high school. They've lived in the camp, they've graduated from high school, and there's nothing for them to do afterwards. There are a few higher ed programs. They're very competitive. Less than 3% of students in the camp have an opportunity to go to college. But this small nonprofit works to prepare them for writing their application essays for college, and they have a 100% placement rate. We have 2 students at Virginia Tech right now who came through this program who are flourishing and doing really well. And so part of what we do at Virginia Tech is match our students who are at Virginia Tech who are interested in humanitarian work in some way, or just interested in volunteering, and they provide tutoring for their peers. They're in college, they've already written an application essay, and so they can help the students as they write their application essays, and they take other classes. It's all on Zoom, and the Virginia Tech students have to do it at like 7 and 8 in the morning because of the time difference. So I just wanted you to know a little bit about what we're continuing to do at the center as students are really interested in narrative and storytelling and the skill of interviewing someone about their experience and making sure that experience makes it into the archive and makes it into the history books about what it's really like on the ground as folks are forced to move and resettle. Thank you.
Hello, good night. Thank you so much. I am now waiting for be the first, but bueno, stereotypes is a little part of the reality that was generalized to a group for their inferiorization. Then I am wondering, it's more complex, but it's something like that. And I am wondering what is your invitation to work against the stereotypes, or how to know how we know that the information that we have about a group is a stereotype. Because for us, maybe it's all the reality because it's the reality that we know. But how to know? Yeah. Because maybe no could be help us to learn about or learn more about the different groups and about ourselves.
Yes, that's an amazing question because, you know, as human beings, somewhere along the line, we had to discern what was dangerous and what wasn't. You know, if there's a saber-toothed tiger coming toward you, you should know, like, stay away from that. But if there's like a bunny over here, you know, okay, then we can categorize. So it's in our DNA, I think, to categorize. Where the stereotype, I think, is damaging, and maybe how to make it to be able to discern is if it's damaging somehow or negative, and it's being used to make withhold resources, and so I think getting to know someone on a very personal level can make a huge difference, and so I think. The only way to really know whether something is a stereotype, that some stereotypes are grounded in reality, but if the stereotype is negative and then results in the rounding up of people and taking them, deporting them somewhere, that to me is the function of that categorization is damaging and negative, and not just damaging and negative to the person it's happening to, but the entire community. And I think that's part of one way to think about it. How I try to talk to students about it, it's really, in this climate, it's very difficult, and I'm not sure it's my business to tell students what to think politically, right? My job, especially as an English professor, as a rhetorician, is to try to help students understand how those stories get told, how those stereotypes get learned, and what their basis is in reality, and how to try to think for themselves. So if someone is telling you this group is that, maybe how do you find out for yourself whether it is or it isn't, and to learn about language and to learn about that, if someone throws statistics at you, and this is how I got started in my research to begin with. I was reading statistics about the, millions of refugees across the world, and none of what was being said about them matched what the actual stories I was getting from people, real people. And so that's part of what I try to talk to students about is where is this information coming from, and how will you discern whether or not you'll believe it or whether you'll try to counter it? Thank you.
Given the very troubling atmosphere in which we're living, my concern is how safe are these people? And what can one do to protect them in this climate?
What I'm hearing is not very safe. We just found out today that 7 international students lost their visas at Virginia Tech. And I think UVA has already announced a similar thing, and there are other universities across the country this is happening to. And the irony to me in that is as I understand it, I might be wrong about this fact, but as I understand it, the students who lost their visas were students who had attended protests last year during the protest activity around Gaza and Palestine. And so, enacting the thing that makes America, America, to be able to, to have freedom of speech and to protest and to assembly is the thing that is putting them in danger. Yeah, so there are a lot of trainings going on right now. Law firms that have immigration lawyers on their staff are providing trainings for folks who would like to be part of the community that is helpful somehow. People who everyone who lives I think maybe not everyone understands this. If you live within the borders of the United States, you have rights. It doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not. If you are within the borders, you have rights. Now, they're not always respected depending on who the folks are, but and whether or not you have status, how you react in a particular situation, or the kinds of things that you can do to be helpful yourself in that situation will vary, because if you don't have documentation, you don't have a specific migration status, there are certain things you can or shouldn't do. And then same thing with someone who does have status. So if you have a J-1 visa, for instance, you work at a university, or you have an F-1 visa, student visa, or you have an asylum case pending, you have papers for that. And so the recommendation right now is to carry all those papers with you. Also, the recommendation is to have a durable power of attorney for all of your finances, and to have a guardian. I forget what the document is called, but there's a document, guardianship, something, so that if you have children, like who can go pick up your children for you if you're detained. So these are the kinds of things people are being advised to do. And so if you're an ally and you would like to help, I really recommend going to the various trainings that are going on. There's the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Immigrants for Social Justice. There's lots of websites out that have some information on their websites, but then there are also trainings that you can go to.
The immigrants that you feature and profile in there with their stories, are their stories changing where they're a little bit more fearful and expressing concern that that the country, that their new home is betrayed them, and not welcoming their brothers and sisters from their native country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a lot of fear right now. It's a really dark moment. There is a lot of fear. And even before this particular moment, if I go back to the little sketches of the people who are I forgot to tell you that the one that is a little Turkish coffee pot, at the bottom left. Amal did not want her sketch included, and did not want her real name. So Amal is a pseudonym. And so this is an oral history, so ostensibly, it's it's an oral history, it's your life, but we obviously gave folks the option to use their a pseudonym if they wanted to. But Amal is from Syria and has family still living there, and was very worried about if her children's faces or her children's names or her name was available, that her family would suffer the consequences back in Syria. So yeah, I think there's absolutely fear then and now. Yes.
Maybe a lighter note. After you edited the transcripts to make them more easily readable, did the speakers then have the chance to review them and verify that that was their intention?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked that, because that's so critical in a project like this, where often people's stories are taken and appropriated. And so we keep in, they're sort of one-off. One of the reasons I like oral history is because it's a long form, and because I'm so interested in I live in the community, I'm part of the community. I don't just go in, interview someone, and leave forever. I might run into them at the grocery store. And so it's critical then to, there's two things. One, we do the interview in what's called a birth to present way. So we ask them questions about their entire life, not just the one thing about them, not just whatever trauma they suffered, or not simply about their resettlement experience, but we ask them about their entire lives so that they're not reduced to just the one thing about them. And then second, all along the way, they're able to read the narrative and be sure that they approve it. Amal, in fact, approved her name and photo being used at the beginning, and it was sort of midway through the project. We made her a little book just like this one with her and her family's picture on it. And all the kids, I got to know the kids really well, and they all were excited to pose for the photograph. By the time the whole thing got done and the little booklet came back to them, it had at least a year had passed, because this all takes a long time. And they got the booklets and they liked them, but the children expressed, that was us then. We're so different now, and we want to put that behind us. And that was a really poignant moment for the students who were working on this too, of, this is a moment in time, this is someone's story at this moment. And then of course we pulled all the identifying information from the narrative and didn't use her sketch. In fact, Voice of Witness, who published, I really recommend if you're interested in these issues, they have a really great book called, I can't remember the name of the book, but it's about a project apartment building in Chicago that was being torn down, and all the people in it were being displaced. The area was being gentrified, and so they interviewed all the people in the apartment building to get the history about what it was like to live in that place. Some people had lived there their whole lives with their parents and grandparents, and the place was being torn down. And I think some people assume that an apartment building is, they still felt like it was their home being taken away. Voice of Witness is, they published this book about the projects in Chicago, but at the last minute, two of the narrators decided they did not want their story included because they didn't want the attention or the press, and they weren't even interested in a pseudonym. And so it happens sometimes at the very last minute, someone will pull their narrative, and so that happens. It doesn't mean their narrative isn't just as important, but yeah, that whole process, that folks are included in the entire process.
Could you say a little bit about the gentleman, the indigenous man?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to get the book now, but I'm curious. Were there many indigenous that you interviewed, what was special about him? What can you say about it?
Yeah. So Rufus is right next to the Turkish coffee pot. Oh, let me tell you why the Turkish coffee pot is in Amal's stead. Because when we asked her where she would like to be interviewed, at the library or wherever, and she invited us into her home because she had little kids, and she made coffee. And they're in the narrative, she tells a whole story about having coffee with her family over WhatsApp. So she misses her family very much, and so she'll take a picture of her coffee cup and then WhatsApp it to her family and say, I'm having my morning coffee with you. But Rufus, who's right next door, as I mentioned, is from the Monacan Indian Nation, and he's one of the few people who is qualified to play the ceremonial drums. And his story is fantastic. He was the first first Monacan Indian Nation student at Virginia Tech. And the idea of coming, he lived in Amherst, where a lot of Monacan Indian Nation folks live. And the drive down to Tech from Amherst is about 2.5 hours. But for them, it was a huge journey. And one of the things that I liked about him was he almost refused to tell individual stories about himself, because in his community is the emphasis, not the individual. And so I had to really use my interviewing skills to get him to tell stories about himself. I would ask everyone, what were you like as a child? How would people describe you? And he immediately turned to, well, my uncles and my grandfather had me work in the garden with them, and then he would tell stories about his uncles and grandfather. And he is very committed to continuing the story, or to making sure the story of the Monacan peoples is known, especially around the Racial Integrity Act. And going back to Shenandoah National Park, the Monacans and the Manahoac were the first people to live in that area before they were displaced by white settlers. And so I already knew a little bit about that history, including, first, the Virginia General Assembly passed the Public Park Condemnation Act in 1928, which blanketly condemned all that land. Rather than tract by tract and family by family, it blanketly condemned it with that act in 1928. That's the same people in the Virginia Assembly had in 1924 passed the Racial Integrity Act. And that, if you know that history, that has essentially erased Native Americans in the state of Virginia. They either had to choose on their driver's licenses or on their papers, either white or Negro. There was no place for American Indian or Monacan. And so that literal erasure was very damaging to the community. And I mean, from a community point of view, but also from the ability to get jobs, the ability for the Monacan Indian Nation to become a federally recognized tribe as well. It only very recently became a federally recognized tribe because they weren't all that time between 1924 up until about the late 70s. They were not recognized. There was no documentation. You have to have documentation in order to get the Bureau to recognize you. So anyway, Rufus was intent on telling that story. And it was just a lovely conversation, and I think that's important to say as well, about what it means to tell one's individual story in relation to the community.
Thank you, first of all, so much for this. This is, as someone who grew up in Appalachia, sort of in the West Virginia, and as someone who now works nationally around immigration, this is incredibly meaningful and powerful.
Thank you.
And I think I particularly I'm curious what you learned about safe community spaces, because I think, I mean, again, from both the Appalachian perspective and from the migration perspective, I think honestly what I've learned over the years, what anchors people is knowing, especially like churches, congregations, like spaces where people could feel like they are a part of something. And I was really, the part of the story I was really moved by when you shared about the Black church that stepped up and said we're going to do the statue. But I was thinking particularly in this moment, and I think something, those of us who are working right now with allies and others who really want to do something, is we say, especially if you're part of a public space like a church or something, this is your moment to both get to know your neighbors, to stand up for people who are around you, and to let people know we are a public sanctuary space. We are a safe space. Right now, the only big success story we've seen is the town in Upper New York, Tom Holman's hometown, where the community turned out, and actually they've returned a family out of detention. And it was only because the community knew and the community came together. So I'm curious, like, what you heard from people around what made an impact for them about feeling safe or connected in their community, especially churches or other community spaces.
Yeah, I think before the last 4 to 6 weeks, it often are the schools and parents groups and churches that and volunteer groups, local refugee partnerships, that kind of thing, that did a lot to make people feel part of the community. And for instance, the local Blacksburg Refugee Partnership went to the Montgomery County schools and said, if someone wants to miss school because of Eid, that is something that the school should allow for, because it's a religious holiday. And so, there's so many stories of that kind of thing. And right now, it's really difficult. It's a lot of risk for anyone to stand up. I think. And so, that would be someone's personal decision. But I think being really informed about what someone's rights are in that situation is really helpful. So that if you work for a social services department, for instance, or a library, or a healthcare center, or a church, those public spaces in the foyer, ICE is allowed to come in there, but not necessarily allowed to come in a private office. And I think some folks aren't aware of that distinction. There's also a distinction between a judicial warrant and a regular sort of ICE warrant. And if an ICE agent shows up and they have a warrant, but it's not signed by a judge in a court, then one does not have to either talk to them or go with them or open the door to them in their own home. And so, and there's lots of little rules and regulations about it. So if you want to be an ally, I would get to know what all those are. So that then if someone you care about in your community is faced with that, the idea of having the guardian document and the durable power of attorney and those kinds of things, that's another way you can step up for someone, is just say, I'm willing to do that for you, or can I help you find someone that you would feel safe sharing your personal information with. And also, that process can help the rest of us understand what our responsibilities or rights are as well in all that process. So that I would just be as educated as you can about it, because it's at some point, if ICE shows a judicial warrant, then they do have the authority to arrest someone. And what you're willing to risk in that moment, you might think you're standing up, but are you creating an unsafe situation? That's something you'd have to decide. But if you know what the law is, you know what due process is, even though due process is a little bit in question right now. But there's this whole thing you can print out from the Immigrant Justice Center that's called the Know Your Rights Red Cards, and it has things that someone can say, and you can print it in multiple languages. It's in Spanish, Dari, whatever. And those are helpful too, because what it does is help someone who is facing this say, I would like to speak to a lawyer. And they can learn how to say that in English if they don't already know. I would like to speak to a lawyer. I don't want to open the door to you unless you have a judicial warrant. And there's all kinds of advice about staying calm and not running and all these things. So that would be one way, I would say, is to get educated on that.
One last question. I'm fascinated with your training doing oral histories. So my question is just really practical. In a few days, we're going to be going to Douthit State Park camping, and we're going to be out there. And part of the fun of travel is just meeting people and chatting and getting to know the area and the people. Have you gleaned anything from your training of taking oral histories that would be like, I'm not asking you to tell us what to do, but will be helpful in engaging in conversation?
Yeah, so It depends on the purpose, right? So if you really do want to have a conversation, and StoryCorps is a great example of that, right? That you often get people talking to each other about an event or about another person. If what you'd like to do is learn about one person and then the other person is the interviewer, I would say, some folks are more comfortable at narrating a story than others. And so you might hardly even ask one question, and someone like Micaiah will talk for an hour uninterrupted. Other people might be more shy about it, and so learning how to follow up and take what they've said and build on, tell me more about that. There are little things you can say, oh, can you tell me more about that? Or, that sounds interesting. What was the atmosphere like? What did it smell like? What did it sound like? Asking very sensory details, and then that gets people remembering the moment, and then just being a good listener. I think I've been talking a lot today, but mostly I am quiet. I ask a few questions, and then I really try to stay quiet while people tell us, which is hard, because if you like talking and getting to know someone, it's really hard. But I love teaching oral history to students because they can go home. They might interview one of their professors, or they might interview someone who has a job that they hope to get someday. So, they might do something more professional like that, but they can go home and interview their family members and kind of get a sense. I do this little exercise with them where you have to interview each other for 10 minutes, and then you have to present to the rest of the group in 15 seconds that other person's story. And the reason I do it is so that they get that experience of what it's like to have your story reduced to 15 seconds. And to think about, well, why didn't they share that detail? That was the most important detail, and they didn't share it, And I like for the students to experience what that is like, so when they themselves are editing a story down or they're doing the interviewing, that they're sensitive to what that process is like, because it's an enormous gift for someone to share their story with you. Thank you.